You're listening to a Raconteur Studios podcast.
Hello and welcome to the After Hours Skin Clinic. I'm Dr. Emma Craythorne, a consultant dermatologist and your host. This is another episode that's going to help you see and spot those red flags in skincare and help you see past the marketing claims and try and get to the real science. I'm going to reel off some classic phrases that you will see everywhere on skincare marketing, and I'm going to break them apart so you can understand what they actually mean. So if we look at a skincare label and think about what these terms are, and they are really designed to be as ambiguous as possible and to try and convey this level of authority, but actually they have very little regulatory meaning. Important things to remember are SPF. So your SPF number or your UVA number that goes along with the SPF, that is really important. That goes through multiple rigorous testing. It has to pass a certain level to be given that number. So that stands probably at the kind of like highest level of trust that we can see whenever we see that in a product. But other things like dermatologist tested does not mean that a dermatologist conducted an independent study. It simply means a dermatologist was there at some point. Medical grade, well, this is the key and, one that always gets my goat, I suppose, because there is no regulatory definition of medical grade in skincare. It's often used to suggest that there's perhaps a higher potency of ingredient being used, but in truth, it's really just being used to suggest things. It doesn't actually mean that it's a higher grade of anything being used. It's trying to give the impression that it's a prescription medicine when actually it is not a prescription medicine. The term hypoallergenic you'll see in quite a lot of things. And again, this is another very vague term and implies a product is less likely to cause allergy. But there's really no strict regulations dictating what can and can't be called hypoallergenic. Fragrance-free is another one. And this doesn't mean actually that the product doesn't contain any fragrance. It just simply means that there's not much of a fragrance to it. It may still contain masking agents, for example, or it may still have things like botanical extracts, as they often have a scent. Non-comedogenic, well, this is meant to mean that it's not going to clog your pores. Now, there's really no universal standard set for this, and quite often some ingredients are thought to clog pores, but when mixed with others, then they do not. So it's a little bit of a guide to suggest that that product is being thought about to try and not clog your pores, but in truth, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. One other aspect to be very careful of is the idea of cruelty-free or free from animal testing, because, again, this can sometimes be misconstrued. Within the UK and the EU, cosmetics testing on animals has been banned since 2013, but there are ways in which some companies do get around these loopholes by testing outside this restrictive area, and then the products can still make their way in. So I think if this is something that is really important to you, that your due diligence is done on this to ensure that your product truly is living up to what is said on the bottle if you've asked for free from animal testing or free from cruelty or cruelty-free, because there is no real law required before putting that onto the bottle. So that is something also to probably consider. Another thing to think about is this idea that the chemicals that are within our skincare products are toxic. And there's a number of different apps that have since come around looking at a lot of these different chemicals and rating them as whether they're safe for you or whether they're unsafe for you. And whilst I very much embrace this idea of looking into the products and ingredients that we're putting onto our skin, I do think some of it can be a little bit harmful, because substances that we know that are pretty safe on the skin and have been through lots of toxicology testing actually often will come up harmful in these apps. And it's all about really understanding that difference between what is the dose of a substance to make it a poison. Because essentially we could regard everything as a poison, like caffeine or water or salt. if we have enough of it. This morning you would have had your cup of coffee, but if you've had 100 cups of coffee, that would probably be a fatal dose of caffeine. So you wouldn't want to be having 100 cups of coffee. And it's in the same way with many of these skincare ingredients, and particularly when it comes to things like preservatives. So you might see branded across skincare products, parabens free, phenoxyethanol free, certain preservative free. But actually, a lot of these preservatives have done a very good job for many, many, many years, keeping our products safe and free from growth of bacteria or viruses and keeping them stable. And now we're having to use other kinds of preservatives, which probably have a bit less evidence behind them compared to these older school versions of parabens, because of this marketing drive suggesting that many of these things are toxic. But actually, in truth, the toxic level of something is all related to the amount of the dose that you're exposed to. And parabens really we consider to be very, very safe preservatives. And it's actually probably because of that decline in the use of these preservatives sees us using different kinds of preservatives. For example, methyl isothiazolinone, which is a newer form of a preservative, which is actually related now to a lot of contact dermatitis for people. In other words, they've developed allergies to it. So we do have to be very careful about the drive that we sometimes have to make certain ingredients seem toxic when actually they're a lot safer than often what the alternatives can be. And with this kind of drive to have more and more natural products, which is driving people to say, oh, my product is chemical free. It's, our entire existence is made up of chemicals. Even if the bottle was just full of water, well, that is a chemical. Even if the bottle was just full of air, well, that's essentially chemicals. So it's really important to try and understand that everything we put on our skin is a chemical. Everything we eat essentially is a chemical. And, the idea of marketing something as chemical free, well, it's almost impossible. And just because something is natural, it doesn't mean that it's going to cause less harm because it is natural. Some of the greatest poisons that we know in the world are actually these natural chemicals. So natural does not equate to being safe, which is something that I think that we probably are starting to understand more and more as people get better educated in this area. But I still see this come up all the time, that natural is better. And actually, the vast majority of the time, the well-researched chemical ingredients that are proven to show a function are often better than a natural alternative, where it's much harder to understand what that dose is, what the interaction of it might be, and actually, is it going to do anything at all by trying to get into the skin or have an effect. Speaking of doses, in the same way that whenever we know something could make something bad for the skin, dose is also something that is incredibly important for efficacy of an ingredient. So in other words, if you think about vitamin C, for example, we know that vitamin C is helpful for the skin when it's in a percentage form between 10 and 15%. And it's presented in a serum that's close to pH 2.5. When it's not in that form, it doesn't matter whether it says vitamin C on the side of the package. If it's not in that form, we can't say that it's actually going to be doing the job of the vitamin C in that form. So just because you've got two things that say vitamin C, it's really important that you've got that right dose and it's in the right formulation to be able to get into the skin. The same thing really holds true as well for things like retinoids. You will have people claiming that their cream is as effective as, let's say, tretinoin. Now, tretinoin is a retinoid. It is our most studied retinoid. It has an FDA license for things like acne, for photo damage, in other words, wrinkles on the skin. And you will have people claiming that their product is as effective as tretinoin. But if it's tretinoin at a very, very low dose, which is not going to be effective, well then yeah, their product might be, but it's not effective at the dose. So it's important to think about what the dose is whenever you're comparing things, not just what that ingredient is. I think the term clinically proven is something that's really worth looking at because there are different ways of people carrying out studies and there is different levels of authority or reliability that can be placed on these different kinds of studies. So quite often, a lot of the studies related to the skincare market will take a group of individuals, normally a small number, apply a product to them and then assess what the outcomes are. But they don't necessarily have to have a control and they don't necessarily have to be that rigorous in their testing process. But depending on what that shows, you can then make claims about the product. The key thing to try and work out what makes a study well run and well organised, well, as a consumer, that's pretty difficult to do, but a really easy learning point is, has that study actually been published in a peer-reviewed journal? And what I mean by that is, in the world of medicine, we have peer-reviewed journals. So these are things like the British Association of Dermatologists. They have a journal called the BJD. There's also the JAD, the American Academy of Dermatologists journal. And if you can find these kind of journals, they go through a lot of rigorous peer reviewing before a study can be published within them. So I think that instead of having to understand reading all of the studies, if you understand that this has been accepted, a study, for example, and it has been published in one of these journals, then typically you can usually align a little bit more reliability to that particular study that may then be related to a particular ingredient or a product. So clinical studies are wide and varied. They can go from being a few people and it's pretty meaningless, and yet companies can still talk about that, up to being incredibly well conducted studies that involve lots of different centres conducted in the best possible way, and then end up in peer-reviewed journals. So there is such a wide spectrum, and clinically proven can kind of fall in any of this minefield. When we think about expiry dates are particularly helpful for skincare and for makeup as well. Particularly in skincare, you have a pot of chemicals and it's just been created. And that formulation, from the moment it's been created and packaged up, it does start to degrade or break down. Sometimes it can be fairly slow in most cases, but certain things speed up that degradation. So things like if it's a very warm day, if you've got a lot of heat, that will help to speed up the breakdown of that product. If it's exposed to oxygen, so depending on how the lid fits on, for example, oxygen might get in and start to degrade some of the ingredients. Also things like ultraviolet light can cause degradation. So the expiry date is truly there for a reason, and actually quite often how we package our skincare products is there for a reason as well. So many will have an airtight sealant on it. Many will be protected from ultraviolet radiation to try and preserve that formula for as long as possible. But in truth, stability testing is carried out on these, but that is why you've got the expiry date. It doesn't mean that it's going to cause any true harm to your skin after that point in most cases, I'll caveat that with. But if you want to get the best out of your skincare, then really using them within that expiry date is going to be most important. It's particularly important for things like SPF, where the filters are more readily broken down by heat, and also products like benzoyl peroxide, which can break down with heat and make chemicals that are probably less favourable in our skin. And then also our active ingredients, so things like our vitamin C or our retinoids, if they're broken down past the expiry date, well, they're just not going to work in quite the same way. So the key is to keep it within that expiry date, and that is important. That's a wrap for today at the After Hours Skin Clinic. So I hope you've left feeling a little bit more like you understand these red flags that we see. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast today, then please don't forget to subscribe. We love to hear the questions that you have so that we can answer them as well in the format just like this. If you do have any of those questions, you can send them over to our Instagram at After Our Skin Clinic or at ahsc@raconteur.tv. Until next time, look after yourself and your skin, put on that SPF, and I'll see you on the After Hours Skin Clinic.